So while this workshop has focused primarily on compartmental models, there are a lot of other type of models that are used in epidemiology that we thought it would be worth covering very briefly, so at least you're familiar with sort of the background on them. The first we want to cover is what are known as meta-population models. These are very, very popular in ecology, and what these do is they represent a system as a population of populations, hence the term meta-populations. So essentially what you have is a set of freestanding models with parameters governing how individuals can move between them. So if we think about, this is often represented as islands. If we have, for example, a populations of birds, each island would have its own SIR model, and then there would be a term to govern the migration of birds between the islands, as essentially they visit each other. Now this is not, however, only ecological. There are lots of things that can be conceptualized as metapopulations. So if we think about wards within a hospital, those are metapopulations. Each ward is fairly freestanding, but patients and clinicians do move between them. Assigned patients within a ward, so if nurses or doctors are just assigned to a particular group of patients for sort of continuity of care reasons, these can be connected communities by something like commuters. So for example, I live in an area where there are two towns that are very nearby and people work and live in both towns. You can conceptualize that as a metapopulation. And then communities within a city or town that coexist but rarely interact. So right now, for example, we're working on a model in Pullman, Washington, where it appears our student population and our sort of adult population don't interact with each other very heavily, and so can sort of be considered metapopulations, even though they essentially live in the same geographic space. So very similar to metapopulations are what are called network models, which are a very, very vibrant and active area of research. So the first thing to think about is, what is a network? So a network is a conceptual way of representing relationships between things. So often we call these things nodes. These can be people, places. If you think about a computer network, it's computers. And the edges are links between those nodes. So for example, if we're talking about two friends, the nodes would be friends and their friendship would be the edge. Occasionally these are called graphs, vertices, and arcs respectively. This is because network science co-evolved in several different fields at about the same time. So if you're a graph theorist, you talk about graphs, vertices, and arcs. If you're a network scientist, you talk about networks, nodes, and edges. They mean the same thing. Networks can be represented in a number of different ways that we're not going to go over in this class, but there's a lot of different ways to represent them. And a network structure is sometimes called its topology. So if we think about networks, there's a lot of different ways to think about how to complicate networks. So there's directed networks, where this is that ties don't necessarily mean the same thing. So 1 is connected to 2 in this sort of example. 2 is not connected to 1. So if we think about this is often used in when we're talking about friendship networks. So for example, 1 says 2 is a friend, 2 does not say 1 is a friend. That's a little sad. Whereas 2 and 3 both identify each other as friends. If you are in epidemiology, you've probably encountered the directed acyclic graph. The directed part of directed acyclic is because it's a directed network. You can think about time-varying networks. So this is where networks change their structure over time as edges are picked up or dropped. This can be, sexual partner selection. This can be just different sort of connections between people. There are weighted networks. So this is, for example, that an edge doesn't just mean one thing. So if you think about the sort of something like an air traffic network, and you think about the connection between Pullman, Washington, a tiny little town, and Seattle, Washington, a big city, and then Portland, another large city, and we think about the edges as the number of passengers moving between those, the weight of the edge between Portland and Seattle will be much bigger than the weight of the edge between Seattle and Pullman. You can also think about these things as things like time and contact. So if we think about this weighted network as, for example, individuals 1 and 2 live with each other, and individuals 2 and 3 only interacted for an hour, there's much more weight behind that connection between individual 1 and 2. Finally, we can think about different types of nodes and edges. So an easy one is, are people susceptible, infectious, or recovered? But this can also be different risk factors, different genders, or potentially a whole host of different factors. Or these can even be things like people and places. And you can do some really interesting work with those. They form what are called bipartite graphs, which is the thing that is well beyond the scope of this course, but is potentially a very interesting sort of way to approach things. There are lots of really cool questions you can ask with networks, and network analysis is sort of interested in the study of the shape and structure of networks. How networks are connected, how do they form patterns. Simulating a process like an epidemic on a network is a very small part of that. So this is a very active field. Sociology, physics, computer science, and math all have their own takes. If you're particularly interested in sort of applied epidemiology on networks, there's a book called Network Epidemiology by Martina Morris. It's now a fairly old book, but it has a lot of really interesting things, especially on sexual contact networks and how we study sexual contact networks. So for simulation purposes, why do we use networks? If you recall from the SIR model, there's this notion of beta, which is this composite of the number of contacts and the probability that contact between an infectious person and a susceptible person will result in a successful transmission event. For most compartmental models, these two components are non-identifiable. Given our data, we can't tease them out. So there's either an infinite or near infinite number of equally well-fitting combinations. If you think about this, if I told you something costs $5 and I asked you to estimate both the price and the sales tax, there's sort of infinite combinations of those things that will give you $5. And this is also very unintuitive when you're describing interventions. If you say, oh, we'll reduce beta by 50%. What does it mean to reduce beta? Have you, introduced a social distancing intervention that reduces the number of contacts? Have you introduced a partially effective vaccine that means the probability of transmission is lower? Or people masking, which will change the probability of transmission? How do you articulate that in terms of beta is quite complicated. Networks fix one of these two components. So essentially, an edge between two nodes is by definition a contact, allowing the direct estimation of the other one, the probability that you have a successful infection given contact. So there's a couple ways to sort of simulate epidemics on networks. One is called the chain binomial model. And here time is measured in arbitrary discrete units. So it's just a discrete time model. And each node has at least a susceptible and infected state. So usually others, but you can do a lot of interesting math on networks if you keep things at S and I. And the major parameter is the per time step transmissibility. So this is how likely you are given a single time of contact to transmit. This allows you to estimate the probability of an epidemic, generate an epidemic curve, represent chains of transmission. It's all actually quite cool. If we think about a very simple representation of this, we can start with one infected individual in this sort of very small network. And we can say that this spreads along edges to other nodes at a probability p, where p is 0.65. So essentially, if I roll a dice or generate a random number between 0 and 1, and I get less than 0.65, you get infected. Now, this is a very, very high probability of transmission because I want to get most of this network infected, even in this very simple toy example. So we do this for the first edge between an infected person and a susceptible person. The random number we generate is 0.42, so this person is going to be infected. We do this for the next edge. We get 0.07. This person is going to be infected. Now we need to generate a per time probability of transmission for each of the three edges that exist. So we can see we do one that's 0.24, that person gets infected, 0.59, that person gets infected, and 0.93, that person does not get infected. So we end up with this network. And this goes on until either the entire network is infected or you have transitions out of the infected state. So you have, for example, recovery or death if you run out of opportunities for infection. So if everyone gets to R before anybody else gets infected. So there's another way to conceptualize these models, which are called bond percolation models. This was borrowed from statistical physics. And here what we think about is every infected individual has one opportunity to pass the infection to each of their susceptible contacts, but they do so in an arbitrary order. So this is what's called a breadth-first approach to simulating this process. So all nodes are organized in susceptible, new infection, current infection, and recovered for an SIR model. For each currently infected node, you test where it passes to its neighbors. Those neighbors are now new infections. Once this has been done, all of the current infection nodes, you move them to recovered, move the new infections to current infections, and you just repeat this process. And basically you watch this percolate through the network. This does not give particular realistic epidemic curves, but it's very computationally efficient, and there's some very appealing analytical properties. So this is often used when you do math about these networks. So there are some obvious sort of complications to the networks we just talked about. Are they direct or indirect? So if they're direct, can edges be in both directions? So are they directed networks? And if so, are they of equal disease risk? So if you think about sexually transmitted infection models, often, even though you say a sexual partnership is reciprocal, so there are edges in both directions, the probability of transmission may not be the same. Are these static or time varying? Are they weighted? Do the transmission probabilities vary based on node or edge properties? So does that change? In our example, it was just a flat probability, but is that weighted by is it a conditional probability? What about bipartite networks? Those, as I mentioned, are sort of person location networks. There's very complicated things you can do with those. And then you can think about different network scales. So far we've only talked about networks of individual people connected to each other. But are these the only type of networks we might be interested in? What about interactions of networks at different scales? So an obvious example is the air travel network, which is very complicated and spans the entire globe. Often folks who are interested in emerging infectious diseases end up modeling the air transport network to see what is the probability that an epidemic that begins somewhere will reach some sort of far-flung area. We can think about commuter networks in the United States. So this is a commuter network generated from census data. We can think about hospital transfer networks. So in my research, especially during the pre-COVID period, I was very interested in healthcare-associated infections. There's lots of interesting networks here. Individual patient-provider contacts produce a network, all the way up to networks of hospitals that are transferring patients between each other. One of the emerging themes of this area is taking a system-level approach to healthcare-associated infections. So not just considering this sort of an individual failing of a doctor to protect their patient, but how do we do this as a healthcare system? So for example, here we constructed a network of 450 hospitals with about 2 million distinct patients and about 67,000 patient transfers in just California. And we reduced this down to 2,332 edges that get rid of the small transfer count. So these are only, I think you have to have transferred 100 patients between each other. And you get, as you can see, this very dense, very complicated network of hospitals connected to each other, where if there's an outbreak in one hospital, it's very likely that that transmission may spread to another hospital. So there are yet other ways of thinking about networks. So we haven't touched on the use of networks at the interface of microbiology, where we use networks to model microbial communities and things like that. We've talked about the differences in individuals, but we've primarily talked about that as, are you differentially susceptible or something like that? You can think about multi-species networks or multi-disease networks. We worked very briefly on trying to estimate the social contact network for a college campus during the COVID-19 pandemic, but this is a very hard problem if you think about the number of potential contact layers. People go to class together, they go eat at the dining halls together, they live in dorms together, they have friendships that are outside of those things based on things like clubs and things like that. So we actually have a number of sort of overlaying networks that all form a much larger contact network. Now, the other type of model that's used a lot are what are called agent-based models. So the easiest way to talk about agent-based models is to sort of recap what we've talked about so far. So if we think about compartmental models, these are fast and they're fairly easy. They're primarily governed by random mixing, and representing heterogeneity is very complicated. So network models are harder to implement, but contact patterns are specified and fixed, and some heterogeneity can exist in the properties of the nodes and edges. Now, what an agent-based model is we use a computer simulation to model lots of individuals, aka agents, in the same environment. And the population is modeled as these autonomous agents, and that autonomous bit is important. What agents are governed by is a set of rules. So this is how they go about their day, how they move, how they come in contact with each other. And what happens is this is an emergent property of behavior. So we say essentially someone goes to work, someone else goes to work in that same place, now they're in contact. We don't just say these two people are in contact. So this is modeling how we interact instead of who necessarily we interact with. One of the best examples of this, actually, I think, comes from the movie Zombieland, where the protagonist of that is sort of governed by all of these rules about how they live their life. So, always check the back seat, make sure to limber up. And what is interesting here is that this is a very flexible approach. You can represent new types of randomness. So if you can think about behaviors, you can have behaviors drawn individually from a distribution. You can say if someone, for example, for COVID-19, what is the likelihood that they wear a mask? You can draw that from a distribution. You can draw that from a distribution based on a number of other parameters, including are they in contact with other people who are wearing masks. Complex results from this can arise from very simple, low-level interactions. The picture I have here, the reason it's a bunch of trees, is this is a procedurally generated forest. This is essentially an agent-based model of making trees that's used for things like video games and movies where we don't want to create individual trees. So we create some simple rules to say, this is what a tree should look like. And then we let a computer simulate the creation of those trees. And this can help discover patterns that other models later describe. So where agent-based models are particularly strong is they can add new types of stochasticity not present. So you have this random but potentially rule-based mixing. You can have interactions with the environment. You can have people make decisions based on where they are, who is around them, things like that. Positions and states of other agents is very important. You can have responsive behavior. So maybe I'm not going to wear a mask unless a bunch of people around me are coughing, and then I'll put one on. So you can model different classes of individual more easily. You can draw parameters from a distribution rather than a fixed value. You can create a new type of agent just by changing behavior rules. But this is also very, very complicated. These lend themselves well to very sophisticated and complex models, but you can often get a little bit carried away with this. It's very easy to add complexity, but it's hard to implement it. More complex models mean slower models, and parameter choices are often difficult to find. So for example, the probability of wearing a mask, now you need to know that. And you need to know that based on other things you're interested in. You need to know the distribution that comes from, things like that. And you need to be able to tie that to every single behavior you put in your model. It's really easy to get carried away with this, and it often shifts to modeling the system and trying to create essentially a sim city, but for your disease process, instead of making sure to anchor it in your research question. And that's an important point. You always want to make sure that you're not just adding complexity for complexity's sake, but this is somehow serving the research question you're interested in. And then the randomness that you can add to this means you have to simulate the system many, many times. So there's some other trade-offs here. There's very few analytical solutions to this. You're almost always going to see simulation results instead of proofs. The analytical methods that do exist are extremely difficult, and they're difficult to describe. So if you consider the figures in this presentation, those are very hard to use for agent-based models. You know, we talk about rules and simulations and how these things interact with each other. It's very hard to just draw those. Whereas for a compartmental model, if you give me the flow diagram or even just the equations, it is now fully reproducible. Whereas for this, you don't necessarily have equations, you have a lot of code. Reproducibility is much more difficult. And often agent-based models become as much a software development project as they do actually a scientific question. And often what you're actually talking about is a lot of very intensive coding. So one thing I do want to touch on is what are called spatially explicit models, which are models that account for where we are in space. So all of these models can or cannot be spatially explicit. So if we think about network models, the nodes of a network can be locations. And indeed, often sort of the link between meta-populations and network models is that meta-population models represent places and they exist as networks. Agents moving in a simulation of a real environment. So agents who have to navigate a building or who will be exposed to something based on the level of sort of contamination in an area. A very granular metapopulation model can be thought of as a spatially explicit model. So if you take a metapopulation where you divide an environment into very small squares and you have a model in each square, that can potentially be a very granular spatially explicit model. And this comes up a lot in ecology, but it can matter a lot in epidemiology. Where do people go to get vaccinated? We need to know that. How far away are they? Where do they go to get water? So for example, if you're talking about cholera, do they go to the nearest well, or is there other aspects of their spatial environment, like elevation, that determine they go somewhere else? How do livestock herders move their livestock around the environment? If you're thinking about herds that come in contact with each other, that's largely a process of moving through space. So these are often presented as very, very distinct models. Oh, are you working on a network model or an agent-based model? But they really aren't. There's a fuzzy gray area at the boundary of all of these. So for example, what if the behavior of an agent is mixed randomly? That becomes sort of a compartmental model. What if we make a compartment for every person? That becomes sort of a very strange sort of network model. What if the nodes in a network add and remove links to each other based on rules? What if we use an agent-based model to estimate the formation of a network? I worked with a group who does this for my postdoc. What if we use a network model to represent the movements of agents through space? So rather than trying to like model space, if we sort of treat it like a subway map and we say, okay, going from, school to home is moving along a network. So there's a lot of interaction between these models. So don't necessarily think of them as all individual and sort of you can have one or the other, but that there are some sort of links and commonalities between them. But hopefully this gives you a good overview of some of the different types of models that people can and do use, so that at least you sort of know what you're looking at as you encounter the wider modeling literature.